Hello and welcome to this episode of The Four Calling Birds. So this week I was very, very lucky and honoured once again to interview our guest and friend Sarah. Now, we all know Sarah and her birth mum Sue from previous interviews on Four Calling Birds about their adoption story and finding one another. I love those episodes. They are probably two of my absolute favourites. But I invited Sarah back onto Four Calling Birds because we wanted to talk about a subject that is still classed as taboo in some ways and perhaps difficult for some people to listen to and talk about, and that subject is grief. It's always worth talking about grief. It's important that we don't hide away from it and that we are not ashamed of it. But just to let you know, during this particular episode, some of the subjects can be quite upsetting for some people. So just listen with a little bit of caution. I spoke with Sarah about two particularly difficult periods in her life where she's experienced grief. We discuss how it affected her immediately, in the short term, and then in the long term, and even now how it's still affecting her to this day. Let's listen to Sarah's interview. Welcome to Four Calling Birds once again, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. And well, it's lovely to hear your voice again, because we were just discussing this is the second episode that you have done with us on Four Calling Birds. And of course, Sue, now I'm going to ask a question before. How do you refer to Sue? How do you...
As my birth mum.
As your birth mum.
When I'm talking about her, I call her my birth mum, and I call her Sue.
Yeah.
And we agreed very early on that was fine for both of us. And when she talks about me, she calls me her daughter.
Right, okay.
So I don't,
We've recently, in this season, also heard from your birth mum, Sue, as well, about your fantastic story about adoption and then finding one another once again. But there are other sides to your life that we want to talk about as well. And this subject in particular is one that I think is different for everybody. The subject is grief. Yeah. And naturally and immediately we sort of conjures up perhaps negative vibes when we discuss it, when you think about it. And obviously that is the case for a lot of people, but I think it's something that I wanted to discuss, and I wanted to discuss it with you because you have stories of grief, and I'd like to explore them a little bit more with you. So whenever you're ready, let's start with your first story of grief.
Yes, and I know, I mean, you've introduced it, but I do feel it's really clear to say these are my experiences. And I think one of the key things about grief is whatever you experience is completely fine. It's your experience. Do you know what I mean? I think we look for, I should feel this, then I feel that, there are 5 stages and nothing's really ordered. Things don't make sense. I found myself laughing a lot at times. But my first experience I really remember was age 14 when I lost one of my first friends. He was my next door neighbour, and he'd had cancer and he died about a year later. And that was a big shock and a big surprise, but it definitely, my big first loss after that was, my major one was my dad when I was 22. And he was a very healthy man, 55, was playing golf, and in a husband and wives competition, my mum looked over, he was mucking about. The next minute he was lying on the floor. She still thought he was mucking about, and actually he'd had a massive brain hemorrhage and stroke, and he died then. And that was a real shock. But the reason I mentioned the loss when I was 14 was because I did remember things about the surprise, the kind of weirdness of thinking about them, dreaming about them, expecting him to be there, all of that. The thing with losing my dad was that I would say I was in shock for about a year, because I just got a phone call. I was working in a restaurant, Covent Garden. I was living with Hayley. We'd been living and a couple of other friends, and we'd been living in London a year, and I was 22. And the last time I spoke to him was around the funeral for Princess Diana, because he asked me whether I'd go, and I said to him, well, no. I mean, I might watch a bit on TV, but I wouldn't go to a funeral unless it was for someone I loved and had lost, or I was supporting someone else. And that kept going around in my head, when he died. But I think I got a phone call to say from my aunt, and this is how I knew it was serious, in the restaurant, to say, your dad's had an accident. We need you to travel back to Birmingham. And I got on still makes me go cold. I mean, it's 97, so it's 24 years ago. But I got on the tube to Ealing, which is where she was based at the time, and we drove in the car, and I knew this was a life-changing moment, because my mum would have rang me if he was all right.
Yeah.
And the way her and my uncle were behaving was we were about to go into something very, very serious and sad.
Did you find, so knowing that, you knew in your heart of hearts something had happened?
Yeah.
During that car journey, did you think at any moment, I don't actually want to ask my aunt, I kind of just want to allow this time to pass, because it's kind of like Schrodinger's cat kind of situation where you think, until I ask the question, he's neither dead or alive.
Yeah.
I'm just in shock.
Exactly. So she was a nurse, and sadly both passed away now, but she was a nurse and he was a policeman, but he used to be an ambulance man. So I didn't want to ask them any questions, because I suspected they had information. I also was shocked when I found out. But so on that journey, it's about 100 miles.
Yeah.
And I smoked a couple of menthol consulate cigarettes, because my aunt smoked them. And we just talked about all sorts of things, and then it would go quiet and I just had the sick feeling.
Yeah.
And then as we pulled, and this is a sort of image that always stays with me, but as we pulled up to the hospital, my two brothers were outside, and they were 17 and 19. And I knew they wouldn't be standing outside if he was alive. So his heart was still, he was on life support, but they'd been told. So I think two things happened really, so much to get it cold. I just had this moment where I thought, okay, life is about to really, really change. I held their hands. I found myself, and shock is sort of extraordinary, I think, for this. We were walking down the hospital, and they were walking me to where he was and where my mum was. And I was saying, just think of all the amazing things he's taught us. I went straight into, he's taught us so much. We'll get through this somehow. And, and in my heart, I just thought, I'm going to park how I cope with this, because, and I'm not just saying this because he died suddenly, and, anyone who knows me would say this, he was like the best person on the planet to me, and funny, wise, gracious, clever, and a real role model for me. And today at work, we did a session on values and what's a value you learned growing up, and who did you learn it from? Straight away, it's something from my dad, Yeah. So we walked to the room where he was, and obviously my mum was very upset. I was allowed to go in and see him, and I sort of things like lifted, so he was on tubes and everything on life support, but I sort of looked at his feet, check it was him. I sort of did sort of strange things, talked to him, and then I said to the nurse, is there another way I can walk out into the waiting room just via a toilet, via something, just a minute on my own? And she said, yes, come with me. And I went in the loo and I looked in the mirror and I just said, park. I don't think I use the word park. I think that's quite a new word, isn't it? But I basically had this word with myself, like, now is about your mum and your brothers. And I felt like I went from big sister mode to, I don't know.
I mean, it's interesting that you adopted that role naturally in that situation of the worst possible moment of your life. Something consciously or subconsciously, you said, in order to deal with this, I could go one of two ways. I could go down the slope, or I can't fall apart. Fall apart because mum and the brothers. So you naturally adopted a matriarchal position and felt in order to keep the family together. And I think, for context, my mum had a lot of mental health problems, so it was very clear in that moment that the person probably with most resilience was going to be me. And self-applied pressure, no one asked that. But then the next day we went, and this is what I mean about the sort of funny moments, because there are those funny moments, and your emotions are so close to the surface, something could just sort of tip you one way. So we didn't sleep much that night. We knew the next day we were going in to switch the life support machine off because there was no signal from his brain. And he didn't have a donor card. Yeah, we used to carry cards, didn't we? Yeah, and it wasn't on him. I know he wanted it to do it, but it wasn't on him. So they said, look, we can ask you. And then I was a bit like, so I wasn't argumentative, but I was kind of going, so what is the point of the card then, if you can just ask us? Anyway. And then this
thing set in, and they said, so we'd like to, before we switch the machine off, what we'd like to do is heart valves, these things. And I went, well, I wouldn't bother with his eyes because, you know, I don't know, last time night test, he's got these crap glasses and stuff. And actually, nurses, they must be used to that. They would, you know, so I was just making gags about different parts of his body I wouldn't bother with. And then the next time I remember, and then I just, you know, definitely in shock, travel back to London, and all my friends were shocked. And I was the first one of my uni friends to lose a parent. So that was also a big moment for us, you know. And it was just such a shock because I suddenly had to, well, like, you know, I'd ring 2 or 3 people, then they told other people. But that evening I was just due to come back from waitressing. And I rang up the house, and Nikki, one of the friends we lived with, answered. And she's like, hi, how are you? And I said, I don't know what I said. I think,
yeah, you must.
Yeah, I couldn't say my dad has died or the word dead for a really long time. And actually, it was in bereavement counselling. And that became funny because I was trying to explain to her the 2 words I couldn't say, and I couldn't say them. And I was just saying, I just don't associate those words with him.
No, because there's a finality to them.
Yeah. But we had a funeral, obviously, and I wrote, I called it just a speech, but I suppose it was a eulogy, and I found that quite easy to write, actually. Mm-hmm. And anyway, there was a moment, I don't think anyone else heard, but there were 2 very funny moments at the funeral. One was when the person leading it, I think it was called a rector, it's the Church of England.
Yeah.
He called me Rachel. And that's not the first time. I get told I look like a Rachel quite a lot. And then when I say that to people, they say, you really do. So I don't know what that's about.
Yeah, that's your name from now on, unfortunately.
That's my name. Yeah.
Adopt it.
Yeah, exactly. And then the other time we were laughing, and all 3 of us, me and my brothers, were laughing. We were on the front row, obviously. And my mum had chosen hymns that were at their wedding. Of course, we weren't at their wedding. So we were just sort of doing, you know, anyway, I absolutely lost it laughing. They laughed as well, which is just embarrassing. You know, it's quite embarrassing. And then people coming up to me after saying, oh, Sarah, I saw you shaking on the front row. And I was like, well, and I couldn't say, well, yeah, I was laughing. And I remember, actually, I just remembered, between losing him and the funeral, I bumped into, because this is 97, there was no email that went round, there was no text.
It's word of mouth.
I had a page, you know, I had a pager, that was about it. And I bumped into one of his friends, a friend he knew quite well. And he said, hello, what are you doing back? And I absolutely lost it laughing. And I said, well, I've had to come back to see Dad, but he's not here. And he was going, Sarah, what's happened? You know, I just think, I mean, he was sympathetic and understanding. But I suppose the reason I mention that, in the darkest, most painful, rawest times, and they are them, you do have those, and I think they hit you sometimes when you're not expecting them, then you prepare yourself, and that's actually fine. There are these moments which are, and people go, oh, it's gallows humour and all that, whatever, just moments of uncontrollable laughter I've had.
Well, I think as human beings, naturally anyway, regardless of who we are, whether we are funny or we laugh a lot in life, I always find in situations of extreme distress, humour shines through. And I remember my best friend lost her mum sadly last year, and I'll never forget the funeral. Was probably like your dad's, was just soul destroyingly painful. Mm-hmm. But in the midst of it, it was a humanist funeral, so it was in the woods, and the clouded over suddenly, and there was just this mighty clap of thunder. And her late husband said, she's got FOMO. She's annoyed because she's not at her own funeral. And of course,
amazing.
It was just what we needed. But I think we do need that. We're going to this almost state of shock where, yes, the alternative is to break down and cry. Yeah. If I can't do that, I'm going to have to flip it entirely and go back to the opposite.
It's like your body sort of protects you. It's getting, the day after the funeral, we buried my dad's ashes, and it was just me, my brothers, and my mum. Yeah. And that was when the guy called me Rachel. So he'd call me Rachel, so I started to get giggles. And then as they were lowering the little box of ashes, my mum turned and said, it's a double plot so I can go on top. I mean, that was it. I was like, what is going on? But I did feel in these moments, that's my dad. Yeah. That's, you know, that's, and I'm not religious, but I kept thinking, oh yeah, he's just making sure that
having this,
he's just making sure that we do remember to laugh and stuff. I don't know if my brothers laughed as much, had those moments as much as me, but I probably felt I was carrying something, a responsibility.
I think you did. I think, like you said, you adopted this role of parent, matriarch, mother, protector of everybody, because you could immediately see the weakness elsewhere. So you did that, but in order to cope with being that, the amount of stress that puts on you, whether you're thinking about it or not, means that everything is, it's almost like everything's heightened. Every smell, every scent, every emotion is suddenly on steroids, and you are even if you do, every dream is vivid. Every, I remember that after the loss of my grandmother, every dream was like Technicolor 4K. It's amazing.
Everything's sharpened, and things like walking. I've had moments, when I've been in, really recent grief, where I've been walking down the street and I sound so weird, but I felt the wind on my face in the way I haven't before. It's like a layer of skin's gone.
And I would never, I don't have the belief in ghosts. I don't think I really.
No, I don't.
I don't. It's hard to accept that I believe that there's nothing there, but I can imagine that somebody in that state of pure shock would think that any small feeling or emotion or memory or gust of wind, you'd be forgiven for thinking it's them. And so, do you know what? I think if that helps, allow that to happen.
You know what? I thought about that. I quite quickly, I was like, I don't believe he's watching over me and all these things, because if I do, for me, does that also mean he's watching over me when I'm in bed with a boy? Do you know what I mean? I just thought,
it's awful that
I can't. I just thought, I can't believe it, because does he watch me on the toilet? I just don't understand. So, but I get it. And you take your comfort where you take it, and it doesn't. And I think that's the thing that I don't know if I ever judged anyone before, but I just wouldn't. I mean, there were times in that year, and it wasn't literally a year and then I stopped being shocked. But I mean, I remember getting to the front of the queue in books, etc., in Covent Garden with a couple of books that I bought for him. It's about 6 months later, and bursting into tears because suddenly realizing, oh no, he's not here. And I felt, I just felt very. I didn't know how I was. There were some days where I didn't know how I'd washed. I didn't remember. I was just suddenly on the tube. I didn't remember getting up. Didn't remember walking down the street. I think the only plus side to the shock was I lost a lot of weight.
Every cloud.
Yeah, exactly. But no, it was very hard. And actually, Stephen, my thought, and I still do it now, is my brothers were only 17 and 19. That's so young to lose their dad, especially such a significantly brilliant dad. And then I think, and I was 22, and then I have to remind myself, that's really young. That is young. It's not 12. It's not 8. No. But somehow I decided, well, I was 22, so I was grown up and living in London, so it shouldn't affect me.
I remember when my mum's mum died, and my mum would have been 44, and I thought, in fact, she was 43 when she died, and I thought, that's really young. To me, that felt really young.
Yeah.
And I think I'm not that far away from that age now.
Right.
And I think, am I going to, it's weird how you do maths in your head like that.
Yeah.
But, it is a really young age. And I know that feeling of, you mentioned earlier about being the first in your group, because we all have a group of friends, and there's always that one person that loses a parent. And for me, it's, like I mentioned, my best friend lost her mum last year. Yeah. And it's so bizarre, because you suddenly realise, nobody's perfect, everybody's going to go. And so your thinking starts to shift. But I wanted to talk about language, because you touched on it earlier. And it's such a fascinating thing. And I would call it a Britishism, but I'm not entirely sure that it is. I think it's a human reaction to grief or extreme situation, is to not, it's the way in which we speak about it, and the language that we use. There's almost a politeness to say, I'm sorry that your father passed, or I'm sorry that he's gone, or no longer with us, or we just cannot say it. And Amy couldn't say the word dead or death. For a long time. And I haven't asked before. She may not still be able to say it. And I find that fascinating in sort of a dark, painful way that, you know, we can cope with burying our loved one, but we can't say that they're gone. It's
Yeah.
almost like that word is the final, excuse the expression, nail in the coffin, and then that's it, they are gone.
Yeah. I think, I mean, I thought a lot about this because I remember someone being irate a couple of years, well, probably 3 years ago now, saying, you know, so-and-so's died. He's, you know, and using all those words and saying, I wish people would stop saying, sorry, you lost him. I haven't lost him. I don't, you know, it's not, I'm going to find him again and all this. And I actually thought it's probably a bit like pronouns. It's a bit like all sorts of things.
Yeah.
I would always piggyback how they're talking about it.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't go in, and for me, it was, I just could not associate. And obviously, the older I get, I'm going to be 47 at Christmas. The older I get, the more I realised that 55 was too, you know, we lost him too young.
Yeah.
I have to say, when all his friends were going, it's so young, it's just so young. I remember thinking, well, no, it is, yeah, but it's 55. And actually, as I've got older, I've gone, oh God.
Yeah.
I see what you mean.
Closer to that age.
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
I could have, yeah, why couldn't it be 85, 90? So, but for me, it was just too final. I couldn't square you need to come back to Birmingham, your dad's in hospital, with arriving and never ever speaking to him again, having a hug, holding his hand, making him a cup of tea. I've never sent him an email. You know, we haven't talked about all the elections since.
No.
Trump, you know, all sorts of things. And sometimes I just think that was a thing that I could. So I did have bereavement counselling.
Yeah.
I did. I sought that out. Yeah.
I love that. One of my oddest reactions to any sort of grief is, you know, whether it's 10 days later or 10 years later, listening to a song and going, they would have heard that song, or they would have never heard that song.
Yeah.
And I don't know why you said about, you know, that made that connection. It's like musical connection. Like, I remember listening to Sleeping Satellite with Tasman Archer the other day, and I remember listening to it in my granny's kitchen, and I think she heard that, she was alive when this was written. And then you know, you hear something by Adele and think nothing.
Never heard it. Yeah.
It's so.
I'm a dates person as well. Like, I mean, to my detriment and also to a lot of my friends' annoyance. So I'll be like, well, no, we met on the 4th of October, actually, because it's a Sunday. And, you know, but that's just, you know, I like dates things. I hate that I'm a dates person since losing people, because, you know, my brain goes 20 years ago.
Yeah.
On the 20th of September, I had no idea my life was about to change in a phone call. And also the other thing that happens is I know every photo. You could show me a photo from around the time he died, and I know if it's before or after.
Yeah.
And, you know, all those things, everything becomes so precious. And people sort of make comments and sometimes judgments about people who hold on to things that are sentimental. But once you've lost someone, all you've got are letters, photos, things they gave you. You're never going to give them another present, receive one. You're never going to have it. So you can just become... And I remember having quite a lot of photographs of him on my wall. And my boyfriend at the time, I got together with 6 months later, said, feels like you're creating a bit of a shrine. And I felt really hurt by that. And, you know, he was hugely apologetic. But actually, I wanted to go, yeah, but I won't see his face in real life again. Yeah. I need to see it, you know.
I think we can be very quick to sort of sneer and judge and perhaps even laugh at the way in which somebody deals with grief. But in a way, we all deal with it somehow, and sometimes we keep it private and inside, and sometimes we create shrines, and you know, we decorate graves, or we keep pictures up,
or people keep them in drawers. People don't get anything out, and then the people say, that was one thing actually I did think about before our conversation, was things that people say to you to try. Now, we're in a world now, aren't we, where we know, especially the last few years, particularly Black Lives Matter and all sorts of things, it's not, you know, it's about actions and deeds and what you say. It's not necessarily what you intended.
Yeah.
So I think things have changed, but I do, some of the things people said to me, and I tried not to judge them. I obviously leaned in more to the friends who said things that made me feel safe and comforted.
Yeah.
But people are like, well, it's only going to happen to you once. So, okay. Other ones were, when it's your number, it's your number. A lot of people said how wonderful that he wasn't ill. And absolutely, wholeheartedly, once I'd got through the hardest part, I'm so glad he didn't suffer. I am so glad. But I would have liked one day to say goodbye to,
But just
you
a
know.
phone call, anything.
Just phone call, anything, just no.
Yeah.
Or to have, you know, spoken to, I was like, oh, I think I spoke to him a week ago. I couldn't remember. And he was that dad that when I rang the house, he was like, hello, Sarah, how's it going? La, 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 I'll get your mum.
Yeah.
You know, I know it's a bit,
We've all got it. Yeah, we all got it.
it's generalization, but you know what I mean? So yeah, things that people say and do, and, you know, you can't skip. You know, I remember being in work and actually I was having a bit of a giggle. I think and they were saying,
A guilty giggle.
you can't skip grief, Sarah. I said, no, I'm living and breathing it every second of the day. The other thing was that I didn't want to frighten my friends.
Yeah.
I didn't want to scare my friends of how hard it was. I mean, those 3 friends who live with me saw it. But I also just didn't, I felt like I don't want to scare you.
Yeah.
And actually, it's worse than you think. And in some ways, not as hard as you think it's going to be. I think it's not how you imagine it.
I think it's like, it's for me, and it sounds like it for you, it's what I fear about grief, in, you know, either as a shock or whether you expect it or not, is it's unpredictable. And we like to think we know ourselves.
Yeah.
And, you know, we like to think that we're in control of our emotions, but grief is one of those things that manifests over the course of a long period of time. And what it is to me, grief is a reflection of the relationship that you have with that person. So like you said, you know, you smell a smell 10 years later and you well up because you might not smell that aftershave for 10 years, but all of a sudden you're taken back to being a 5-year-old child. And, you know, and that's what doesn't frighten me about grief, but it makes me cautious of grief is that I can't control it. And, you know, we don't like to be, we're far too British to be caught out in public crying for no good reason. But that's how like I said, I don't fear it. There's no point in fearing something because it's going to happen, but it's that sort of, how is it going to happen? And are you going to really torture me today? Or am I going to have a good day today?
Yeah. I had a meeting with someone first thing this morning, a work meeting, and it's the first time I met her, and she mentioned, I think people may be a bit more open because of COVID and things, but she mentioned that her father has died in February. And I said, February 2021? She said, yeah. And I said, gosh, that's so recent. And she said, oh, thank you for saying that. And I just thought that's the other thing, is that you can often feel a pressure to move on, to get over it, someone said to me, you won't get over it, you'll get through it. And that really helped me, actually. But you go, oh, it's 6 months, I should be all right. Oh, it's a year, it's the anniversary, right? Let's take it, let's exhale now. It's been a year, you know, all these things. And people just want you to feel better as well. And you want them to know that you're feeling better. And I don't like people worrying about me.
No.
So, yeah, I just think, actually, I always, you know, if I can see someone struggling and it's 18 months ago, I do say it does get easier, but that is recent.
I think you made a very valid point about, you know, being at a different time now. It's a different world, you know, from 24 years ago.
Yeah.
But even things like acknowledging things like grief is something that you shouldn't be ashamed of. And I did this the other day, and I said, I sort of came out of the closet, so to speak, and said, I'm jealous, and it really hurts, and I hate it. And it's the first time I've ever said those words. But it's still not that long ago, and it still hurts me like the day he left. It's not something to be ashamed of, and we should be saying to people, that's great that you're having a good day, remember that. Or today, it hurts so much, I want to pull my own heart out. And there's no valid reason why. It's just, and as humans, we need to celebrate the way in which we do things, whether it's a long drawn out thing or whether it's a quick look, I need to move on because that's how I want to do it. And it's part of that acceptance, you know, everybody being different, because everybody's grief story is different, and your brothers will have a different story, your mum will have a different story. And like you said, it can be frustrating at times to think, oh, you're still going on about that, but then you have to stop and think, I wasn't there, and I didn't suffer the way she did.
People don't know what to say, they can't fix it. I think we're getting better at understanding that we can't fix other people's problems, and grief is definitely not something you can fix. So like I say, you know, the people that was saying, oh, you know, Sarah, maybe it's time to do this now, or, you know, I didn't judge them for that, but I spent time with the people who just let me be. You know. Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that particular grief story, because I know, like you said, whether it's 2 minutes or 24 years, it's still, you relive it every time you talk about it. So thank you for doing that. But I know that you have another grief story as well, don't you?
Yeah, I mean,
It's a completely different one.
it is. Yeah. Well, actually, I've had three significant losses, I would say. My dad, my friend's mum, who was like a second mum to me growing up, and she died, and she was the person I went to the night that I'd seen my dad in the life support machine, and my dad walked our dog every single night, no matter what time he got home. And I walked her, and I walked round to hers, and she said, "What on earth are you doing back?" And I told her, and she died 6 years later, and that was very, very hard. But my I still, I just have this. They adored each other as well, But no, my the other significant loss is my brother. So after I was adopted, my parents they tried for 9 years. They adopted me, and then 3 years later they had Andrew, who we often refer to as AJ. He's Andrew James, and my dad used to call him AJ. And then 2 years later they had Stuart, and so suddenly they had 3 children under 5. And it's not uncommon for people who, having struggling with fertility to then adopt or, and have their own children. So, and, in terms of the adoption thing, I mean, you try telling them that, I'm anything 100% their sister, because people used to ask that when I was growing up. But so, so I described that image about coming back to the hospital and the 2 of them are standing there. The one, out of the 2 of them, the one I worried about the most after losing Dad was Andrew, the middle. So he's middle of us. And so that's 97, we lost him. And it was very clear by about 10 years later that he was really, really struggling with mental health problems. I've always felt like you can survive on low self-esteem but quite good social confidence, or you can survive with good self-esteem and like one mate, But actually, if you've really got a deficit with both, life's very, very hard. And that was him, a kind, caring, gentle, loving person. They're really, Andrew and Stuart are real 2 halves of my dad.
Yeah.
Stuart is great. He looks a spitting image of him. It's extraordinary, which is lovely, actually. I found it, sort of surprising, but it's lovely. Funny, practical, all these things. And Andrew is the sensitive person with empathy and all of that. And yeah, by 2007, I started to have conversations with him about whether, and we could talk about language in a minute with this vocabulary, but whether he would ever contemplate taking his life. Probably by 2006, actually. And in 2007, he made an attempt. He made 2 attempts in 2007. And then in between that, and then he did die by suicide in June 2009. We talked about it, and his thing was, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it for you guys. Mm-hmm. And I always had this thing at the back of my mind, which was, I can't expect someone to live you can't expect someone to live for their brother, sister, and mum. That's no life.
They need to learn to live for themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
To want to be alive.
Yeah, and obviously we'll talk about people's responses to suicide because it's very complicated. But yes, so he died by suicide. Took me a while to say suicide. I kept saying, but I did read my best friend's Baba. And I have to say, he really carried me through my loss of my brother, particularly. But he gave me a book, and he made a joke actually, because it was coping with suicide. And he sent me that book in the post because I'd referenced it, so he sent it to me. He also read it. He didn't mention initially he'd read it, but of course he has, so he could be there, And then he did say at one point, "Are you aware of this? Like, this is a whole, not volume, what do I mean? A whole series of books, and one of them is coping with hay fever." So that was hilarious because it was like, "Oh yeah, hi, I'm looking for coping," And in it said, "Try to be direct with the language you use." Now we say died by suicide. We shouldn't say committed, because that's from when it was a crime.
Yeah.
I mean, the notion of someone taking their life and it being a crime is just insane, isn't it?
Yeah.
But yeah, so, but then it was still very much people saying committed. So it was like, to use direct language, because it stops people from going, sorry, Sarah, did you say he did it? What? And it's so true. I found myself saying, oh, he's gone. So I sort of had to learn to do that. But that was, so I was in work. I got a phone call and from my mum. There'd been, 2 or 3 attempts over the 2 or 3 years. And I didn't ever see him being 85 and dying of something.
Natural causes, yeah.
Yeah. But I also didn't think he would die by suicide.
Yeah.
I couldn't sweat, And anyway, my mum rang me, it's 10:30, and she said I was doing invoices and payroll. And she, I've got a more glamorous job than that, but anyway, she rang me and said, well, I don't know what she said. I just remember I kept saying, but he's still alive. But he's still alive, isn't he? He's still alive. And she was saying no. And my whole body just shook. And I went to the car park back of work. I rang my colleague. He came out to see me and I was just shaking, crying. And he said, right, what do we need to do? And I said, I need to get to Euston. I need to go back to Birmingham. And but on the way, so I go to get my coat and bag. The colleague, Matthew, who I sat next to at the time, who again was amazing, he knew that this was in the background a bit.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what I said, but I just said something because I remember him looking very shocked. And then looking even more shocked. So I was saying, so-and-so, this supplier, and the thing is, this invoice needs to be processed, and this, and this. And he was so brilliant at going, okay, yeah, great, no problem. And then we got outside in the taxi. I rang Baba straight away. And then when I got on the train to Euston, I walked down to the buffet cart and I bought Hello magazine and a chocolate bar and a packet of crisps and Diet Coke, probably know me. And I just thought, and I'd told 2 or 3 people, they were telling other friends, messages were coming through, a couple of people rang, I didn't pick up. And I just thought this app, because only about an hour and 10 minutes, really fast train, I just thought this hour and 10 minutes is a pocket of time where I'm just going to park it. I don't know, I sound like I'm quite strange, I think, talking like this, but I just thought when I get off that train, and it sort of, of course it triggered this thing in me, which was like, when I got off this train, my life is not going to be the same again.
Yeah.
So for this hour and 10 minutes, I'm going to try my, it wasn't that easy, Stephen. It's like just
no.
lean into Hello and see what was going on, with people's weddings and holidays and things. But I just remember thinking, I can't, it's too big. I don't know, And my mum had found him, my brother. So I knew that was going to be something I needed to support, and how horrific and everything. And I knew from a couple of things I'd read, I thought, oh God, there's probably going to be an inquest. I knew that the flat would become a crime scene. I knew all these things. And so huge shock.
Yeah. Had he been living alone at the time?
He was living alone. He'd been living alone for about 3 or 4 months. And he had a girlfriend and a job.
Yeah.
And what I've learned since is that actually for someone like him, that option never went away, but he did it when he felt stronger.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of frightening thing. And also, I suddenly started reading more after he died, going, why didn't I know this? I can't believe I didn't know. I do know that it felt selfish that he was staying alive for us. Because, of course, the odd person said, gosh, Sarah, that's really profoundly selfish thing to do. Not many people. I work in theatre, and not everyone's perfect, obviously, but we deal with everything on stage. Mm-hmm. So, in theatre, if you made a homophobic joke, it would be silent. There would be no, and it's generally open-minded, liberal environment, So I didn't feel judgment from my colleagues.
No.
I didn't when I met people later, when I went to a support group. There's all the stories where, it happened this many months ago, my line manager knows, but no one else in work. I just thought, oh my God, they couldn't talk about it. There's a lot of shame, a lot of judgment. And the odd person that did say that a few people really did he leave a note?
Yeah. And
in the end, and I said, no, he didn't. Oh, that must have been hard. I said, do you know what? About a quarter of people leave notes, apparently. Mm-hmm. I would be reading that note for so long. Every letter, every word, I would be trying to unpick and could I know? What could I do? And then it just, but also I thought, why do you need to know? And only 2 people asked me how he did it.
Yeah.
And I did judge them.
Yeah.
I did think, I don't know why you're asking me that.
Yeah. It's kind of, I think for some people, it's that sort of, it's almost like I'm in an awkward situation here.
Yeah.
I feel like I ought to ask a valid question. How did he die?
Yeah, maybe judging is a bit harsh actually, but what I mean is I thought, you know what, and I know this is now a word we use a lot, but I instantly felt unsafe with them. I just thought you want to know the detail of how he died, and I'm not going to talk about it on this because I think it's too triggering for people. But you know what I was being told, men tend to use more violent methods, and women escape. You use it as an escape, all these things. And I just, I remember saying to one person, because I said my mum found this, and oh my God, how, why, what happened? And I said, you know what, I don't want to go into it. But honestly, for the majority of people, and massive majority, were so kind to me and supportive. I mean, what's quite amazing, and I'm sure I think this happens when people go through any kind of trauma, it's suddenly everywhere. So suddenly I'm watching, I think I was watching Cocktail or something, I don't know if it's months later, and you suddenly go, oh God, suicide in it. I don't remember that because it wasn't relevant to me when I watched it aged 14, So people were brilliant at going, oh, you know that film, that feel-good film?
Yeah.
Muriel's Wedding. You know that feel-good film? Don't watch it.
No.
Yeah, don't watch it.
Because mum takes her life in it. I've just realised.
It's a feel-good film, yeah. And this is the thing that kept coming up, and because in theatre as well, it's actually, so people would say, you know what, Sarah, I don't think you need to see that play right now. And actually, I still get messages from friends saying, have you seen this play? And I'll say, oh no, and they'll go, oh, you just need to know this. So you think, oh gosh, it is sort of, it is everywhere when you, like anything, when you experience it.
Yeah, I mean, you live with it the way you deal with it the way you deal with it. You'll never escape it. But interesting you say about people wanting to know the details. If you were to say my brother died in a car accident, they wouldn't immediately say, oh, did he not have a seatbelt on? He went through the windscreen. You end it there and it's fine.
Yeah.
And nowadays, again, through exposure and it being not normalized but being discussed, we go, they died by suicide. I'm sorry to hear that, and that's the end of the
I'm really sorry. It sounds really painful. What I really appreciated was when I didn't expect this, but I really felt really, really kind, particularly as when people said, that's really sad for you and for him. And I'd be like, thank you for including him, acknowledging him and his pain. Because obvious thing to say, you don't do it if you're feeling all right, So we did need to, so he had a girlfriend, and we did need to go and tell her, which was heartbreaking because, and you go, oh, but you had a job and you had a girlfriend, but I think one thing my brother and I, Stuart and I, have never felt, or my mum, is anger, ever. And it's not quashed. It's not something that I'm suppressed. He tried so hard for so long to live and be happy and find joy in things and be happy and just exist for us. I think it must be very, very, very hard in a different way and complicated if you didn't know the person was struggling, or if they never told you. It is very, very unlikely someone takes their life if they haven't either attempted it before or thought about it. And
I think it's like we were talking about language and words and saying things like that. To hear people say, I'm sad for him, it shifts it away from being a shameful thing to do. And it becomes you're right. What must he have felt to do that? Because it's not a selfish thing, it's a disease, something that you go to a hospital for or your doctor for. It's a disease which, if untreated, ends in death. And I can't even begin to explain how important it is for people to shift their thinking away from it being something cruel that you would do to a family. And actually, it is the only option left for some people. And I didn't know. I appreciated it and I understood it because I've been on both sides. I've been that person who wanted to do it and who had tried, and then I've been that person who saw what happens when somebody takes their own life and have been there when they find the person when they find the body, and you suddenly your thoughts just get turned upside down, and all of a sudden you think, okay,
Yeah.
that's what happens. That's what's left behind. That's what, what must he have been going through. And it was, it's sad and it's tragic and it's all these things that you see in the movies, but it's so much more intricate and detailed than that.
Yeah.
And like you said, everybody's different. Your brother was different. He had his own battles and his own struggle,
Yeah.
but everybody's different, and everybody comes to that decision or through that a journey of their own. They get to that final moment, and removing the stigma around it and the shame around it just means that we can then start to treat it a little bit better, or treat it as the illness that it is, and respect the person that does it, and respect the people left behind, and not treat them like victims of something, but just somebody else that's suffering grief and loss.
Yeah, and the other, exactly. And I know, and this is the bit that makes me saddest, I know he thinks, I remember him saying, you'd hate me at first, but you would be better off. And that was always the thing that was awful, was, I know he thinks ultimately he didn't believe, all those people that turned up to his funeral, a bit to me was like, where have you been?
Yeah.
Where have you all been? But the other thing is that the two things can sit alongside each other. It's just like a massive thing for me, just that I'm learning all the time, is the things can sit alongside, 5 things can sit alongside each other. Do you know what I mean? So it can be complicated and feel hurtful. I think I didn't feel hurt, but people I met who'd lost parents to suicide, shared a different emotion to me. And I understand that. And also partners who are left with children, husbands and wives, etc., left with children, going, but you've left me to do all this on my own. And, I didn't have to deal with any of that. So I don't blame people for being angry, but in my personal experience, I didn't feel any anger at all. I just felt sad for him.
I think anger manifests from being out of control of a situation. So I was angry earlier at
the tech issues.
The tech issues, because I'm not in control. I was out of control.
Yeah, interesting.
And for me, the situation I found myself in, I was living with my sister, and it was a neighbour of ours who, to me, because I didn't know him that well, out of the blue, had taken his own life. And the anger I felt wasn't at him doing it. It was because my sister had been the one that found him and had tried to resuscitate him, as she then suffered and continues to suffer now as a result of it.
God.
But the immediate reaction for somebody would be to say, how selfish of him to do that. How could he do that to my sister? I think, but if she had found him after he'd had a heart attack or a stroke or anything else, I wouldn't feel that. So I have to strip back that anger towards what he did. It happened because he was ill, and it was just unfortunate. Somebody was going to find him.
Yes.
And it was just my sister on that day.
Yes.
And it was your mum who was with your dad when he died.
He definitely, my brother definitely, you could tell had, I was going to say orchestrated, that's terrible, had his intention was for police to find him. We could tell from that, but my mum knew something was up and went in before they went in. So actually, and that's a very, very hard image. It's one of the worst images you can imagine, really, and particularly as a mum. And so my heart breaks when I think about that. And we did, but then 6 months later we had the inquest because there was a bit of a question mark about whether it was suicide, which was sort of madness given the circumstances. So then you're in an inquest, reliving it. I had to give evidence, and you just feel it's going to sound like a strange thing to say. The loss of my dad was a bigger shock because because other than being, I just sobbed in front of a film when a dad died aged 13 and got, oh my God, what would I do? I'd had that moment, but I had no idea that he wasn't going to be around for my adult life.
Yeah.
And I had thought about my brother. So it was a shock, and my body went into shock physically and everything. But I don't lose any weight, Steve. But I did feel it was just a more complicated grief. But I had thought about it and been scared of it. So, yeah.
I've had an interesting discussion with somebody else who lost a relative by suicide, and she admitted one of the worst and most awful feelings that she felt was a sense of relief, in terms
Right.
of not that she was relieved had gone,
Hmm.
but it was a relief that she and he, her brother,
Hmm.
were going to suffer no more.
Yeah.
They knew it was inevitable. Everybody knew it was
Yeah.
inevitable, which is a rather almost dark and macabre kind of feeling to live with. But
Yeah.
it
It's
is
like
the
cancer. It's
yeah,
like
but
terminal
it's
cancer.
exactly like that. It's a
Yeah.
terminal illness for some people. But she said the worst part of him dying wasn't that he died by suicide, was that there was a sense of relief. And I immediately thought, no, you're right, how awful to feel that. But then I remember my grandmother having had Alzheimer's for 3 years. And we knew that it was coming. We knew that the end was coming. And the pain that we lived through for those last 3 years was unbearable, because
Yeah. So
you're
cruel.
living knowing that the end
Yeah.
next. And yet I didn't feel. And when she died, we felt relief. We all felt relief, because she wasn't suffering. There was the final day had come, and I was trying to explain that to her in the best way I could, but I
Hmm.
don't. I kind of, like you said, with language, it's quite difficult. I don't know if she got it, but I kind of tried to make her feel that actually relief is part of grief.
Hmm.
It's that sort of, like you said, the loss of your father dying so suddenly was unbearable, but in a way he hadn't suffered through years of
Hmm.
illness. It was his time was then, it was just too soon, but he didn't suffer through years and years of illness, and in a
Hmm.
way that was your relief. And I think it's just taking that word and saying, okay, it's not something we should feel guilty about, but we should accept it's part of this process.
Yeah, I think that as human beings, we're just so keen to order our thoughts and feel things one at a time, and that things are binary. I'm either happy or I'm sad. I want to simplify this. Look, I mean, relationships are complicated. They can be full of joy one minute, frustration the next, etc. Um, I mean, anyone who has a relationship with me obviously wouldn't say that. They would just talk about the joy. But but that's the same with grief. You can feel. I often say I do quite a lot of sort of workshops with young people going to theatre, or mentoring, all that kind of stuff. And I'm often quite open about the loss of my dad. And I say, I could pretend to you that my whole working life was strategic, and I did this job in order to do that. And God, but every job I've ever gone for is to try and enjoy that job in the moment. And 20 odd years later, I'm able to make it make sense. But the thing that happened when losing my dad was I was taught in a phone call, life can change in a moment forever.
Yeah.
And the whole thing is life is short, life's too short for this and the other. Oh my God, you learn it the hard way.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do, I do I go for things that I've tried to go for job. And when I'm talking to young people, I think, oh, I may as well just say it. Look, I lost my dad very suddenly when I was 22. And from that point onwards, I wanted to work in theatre. So I persevered, managed to eventually, and each job I've gone for, I've gone for the job because I think I'll enjoy it for that job.
Yeah.
Not what it might lead to, because I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So I'm not grateful. So this was a long-winded way of saying I'm not grateful for the experience of losing my dad, but I do know that it's taught me to live. I don't get very angry, actually. And it's interesting what you said, Stephen. I'm going to really think about this. I think it's because I don't really try to control that much.
Yeah.
Because I know I can't.
Yeah.
I couldn't make Andrew live. I would have moved in with him in a heartbeat, given up work in my life in London for the rest of my life if I knew that it would have made him happy and happy to be alive. I'd have done it in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
It wasn't going to be.
No.
Wasn't going to do that. So yeah, I think look, pain, loss is on the horizon for everyone. In low moments, I worry about my next loss. I get scared about my next phone call that goes, this person's gone.
Yeah.
That's very real for me. And I have to work on, that's probably my biggest source of anxiety. And I have to work on it.
I think, you've had that phone call. I've had that phone call. It's the old rug from under you sort of
Yeah.
metaphor.
Yeah.
And so whilst we've experienced that sudden loss, shock loss, and we have dealt with it, and we've come through the other side, that's great, because it's almost like a vaccination, I suppose, for the next one. But it doesn't mean that needle isn't going to hurt the next time.
No.
But because we know what that sounds like. And there is going to be that moment where you look at your phone and go, they never call me.
Yeah.
Here we go again. It doesn't prepare you. It never prepares you.
No.
And in fact, even when you do half expect that phone call.
Yeah.
I remember last year, 2 days before she died, my best friend saying she's not got long. And yet when she rang, I was shocked and like,
Yeah.
So.
Because before it happens, we've all got those people in our email inboxes on our phones. I've got WhatsApp messages I need to respond to. Oh, I must see that person. The other weekend I couldn't go to a weekend with my best girlfriends because of moving house palaver, so I couldn't go to that. And and everyone's saying, oh, there'll be a next one, and of course 90% of me goes, I know I'll be the next one, it'll be all right. And 10% goes, oh my god, but I don't know what's around the corner. And I'm scared, So that's why I always try and tell people really good stuff that I think about them. I always pass on stuff that other people have said, because there's nothing like hearing from a third party. It's always better, isn't it? Yeah. Oh, I met so and so, and they were saying, it's such a nice feeling. So always try and do that. Never. I mean, Tom and I, neither of us are particularly argumentative with each other. So, but I would never go to sleep, with a bad word or anything like that. Try and let things go. Try to choose my battles carefully. So there's all sorts of things that I think my dad taught me, but also loss has taught me as well.
Yeah.
No.
And I'm going back to being a child and that conversation, and being in church and that conversation about death. And it's almost like, don't upset yourself. Don't talk about that. Don't. Whereas now I think, but it's going to happen. You can't deny somebody the right to discuss death, because we've all had that conversation about, what song do you want played at your funeral, or do you want this or do you want that? And I do, occasionally I'll entertain the thought, but what I also do is accept that this is my lot. So we've all read The Secret. We all thank the universe for what we've got, and I do genuinely mean it. And I don't know who I'm thanking or what I'm thanking, but I'm grateful every day that I wake up. But I accept that I could be 38, I could be 55, I could be 112. I don't know.
Yeah, I know.
And there's no point in fearing that, but respect that it's going to happen. And, maybe I do want to be sort of conscious of somebody dying before it happens, so I can perhaps say goodbye and tell them I love them one last time. But then I accept that might not be the case. And just trying to subconsciously live like that. So,
relinquish a bit of control.
Yeah. Telling, like you said, not going to bed in an argument. I just can't do it. I'll lay there all night going, staring, going, we're not going to sleep until this is resolved. And we're both stubborn, so it makes it more difficult.
Oh, are you? Oh, yeah, that's hard.
We're tired a lot of the time.
I'm too lazy to be stubborn. I'm too lazy to be stubborn, I think.
Yeah, no, we're too argumentative, the pair of us. And so I think if I could offer a lesson to young and old is, don't have death in your peripheral vision all the time. Don't treat it as something like remember when you were a kid, don't do that. If a wind will change, don't put that face, the wind will change. There's threats, but always keep in the back of your mind, just when you're arguing, when you're walking away, or, when you're saying goodbye to somebody, just be aware that may very well be the last time. Not in a dark, morbid kind of way, but just to tell them that you love them. Give them one last hug, or, I always tell my nephews how handsome they are every day. Every time I see them, they are. But I tell them because I want them to remember that. If I did go tomorrow, I want them to have, and it sounds a bit airy-fairy, but why not be like that? Why not be a bit more positive and just, talking about memory, I hate remembering or forgetting things from people I've loved and lost. I think I can't remember their voice, or I can't remember the last thing they said, I know, and memories, and that is hard. The good thing about time, and it's a cliche, but the good thing about time is things do get easier, and the memory doesn't remember pain in the same way. I would say the raw moments are pretty raw still, but they're far less frequent. Yeah.
But But the downside to the time is memories fade, which is why, going back to what I said earlier, you might get a bit obsessed with photos or letters or things, but that's all right.
But we live in a generation where my voice and my body will forever live on TV, and we've got cameras and voice notes and Instagram, and so we'll never not be dead. We will all live forever. But the generation of people like your dad and my grandparents who we lost, unless we had a Cinecam.
I know. What I wouldn't do is just have a video of his voice, video of his face and his voice.
Yeah.
Magic. And often I think, actually, what I wouldn't do is just make him a cup of tea. Just make him a cup of tea and sit. So actually, you can't live your life, I totally understand what you mean about your nephews and all of that. But you can't live your life like, every time I saw Hayley, I was like, Hayley, I love you. I think you're a really special person. You're funny.
No one thinks
wise
so.
Give me a hug. It might be our last. We both trip over quite a lot. So chances are one of us would turn around the corner and an accident. But you can't be. That's intense, right? That's intense. Imagine if you're holding your nephew's faces. You look at me, remember me. You might never see me again. All that.
But I'm drunk.
But there's a balance, isn't there? There's. I think just tell people good stuff that you think about them.
Yeah.
Just tell them.
I think it's get into the habit of it, because now with me, I go in. They're 14 and 11. They're at that age where they don't want to talk to you. Make them come downstairs, come here, give me a kiss, give me a cuddle, show me your face, let me see how handsome you got. And then I say, now go away. I don't want to see you. I love you, but you can go and do your thing, play on your computer. But I always want them to know that they've got a good memory. Because I have that. I do. You've got that with your dad.
You do remember that stuff.
And the way he answered the phone, or making him a cup of tea, and think, if I can impart that, now I might not die for another 50 years, but they'll look back and go, oh, do you remember when we used to do that thing and he'd hold our face and tell us how handsome we were? Because otherwise they're left with a dwindling memory. And did he say that? Or,
no, it is lovely. You're absolutely right. Do you think you'd want a cake sale at your Do you think you'd want a cake sale at your funeral?
I'd want a show-stopping bake-off. Because I think because the stress of baking would distract people from the fear of the funeral. I have funeral fear, like terrible.
Yeah, of course. Fear. Oh my god, awful.
And so I think if somebody said to me, and at Jill's funeral last year, I had said to my best friend, "Would you like me to make a cake for the wake?" Because Jill loved the last birthday, Jill's last birthday, I made her favourite cake, carrot cake, and I said, "Would you like me to make the cake for the wake?" And actually having that task, I had a job to do. I had to get a cake there. I had to get through that service, and I had to get through to the wake. And so actually it took the pressure off. So I think for my funeral, I'd like a show-stopping bake-off.
Okay.
And I'd like you to represent my life in baked form.
The problem with this for me, and I'm flashing myself to think, I'd be at your funeral even if you died first. But I'm not interested in the scientific side of baking, which is why I can't do it. Yeah. Because I like to eyeball, and you can't with a cake, can you? No, it's about science, and I've not got that. I've not got that down. So sorry.
No, and funnily enough, although I love cooking, I love the baking. I love baking because it's controlled. Because I have adult ADD, and so it's like a little merry-go-round, and they're all the time.
Well, that makes sense then.
Whereas baking, I have to go and focus.
Yeah, okay.
You can't stray away and go off down that little path.
And it's rewarding. You get results.
You get cake. I think there's cake in there actually. Look, peanut butter cups.
Oh wow.
There's always something, but yeah, no, baking is control, total control.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I can zone out, and it was that or drugs, and I can't afford drugs, so
no. And cake, and
they haven't got
the side effects. They were,
yeah,
not yet.
Not yet. Meredith will come up with that one.
I'll do that one.
Yeah. Oh my god! Right, I'm going to end it. Sorry, Jess is going to be like, "Shut up, you two." Right, I'm going to end it there. So I'm going to say, Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast, and also for sharing two very emotionally raw stories, but doing it so honestly and beautifully. I really do appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. And my main reason for saying yes and doing it was just I hope it helps one person, you know.
So, Stephen, can I just say that I think I appreciated listening to that interview, because appreciate is not the right word. I can't think of the right word to say, but the way that your conversation normalised the conversation around death and grief, I felt was really important, because it's really difficult, isn't it, for us to talk about grief and death, and it almost feels like we can't talk about it without a hanky in our hand. And I felt that you guys talked about it and made it really safe and made it really normal, and you created a really safe environment to talk about that subject where people can talk easily and openly about a really difficult subject. And I think our wider social attitudes need to change and normalise this conversation about death and dying and grief. And then that helps families and people that are experiencing death in real time right now, but also helps
years later
recce past losses. Yeah, absolutely. And death is part of life. It's hand in hand. We're all going to experience death as we all experience life. And I just think it's so important. And I love the way that you talked about it quite candidly. And, and it's not about trivialising it. You didn't trivialise it. You just normalised it. And I think that's so important, because people are so scared to talk about death and grief.
Gosh, it's so much easier said than done, though, isn't it? I know.
It is, yeah.
It's one of those things.
It's for us, for Sarah and I think, obviously I had experienced Sarah, so to speak, through her previous interviews, but I'd never spoken to her one-on-one. And so for us, we did enter into it as sort of familiar strangers. I mean, we hit it off right away, as I knew we would. But there was an element of distance. So, I did and the reason I wanted to do this interview with Sarah is because you had done her adoption story interviews, and I knew that was an emotional thing for you, her adoption story, and I wondered if it would upset one or both of you if you discussed, especially the subjects with each other. Not that you shouldn't have done it because we'd experienced your grief. I just wondered if it would be a different story.
Yeah,
and
I think you're right.
I hope for Sarah's sake that I made it a safe place for her. I tried not to talk over her as much as I could, but I did want to ask 1,000 questions. But I really did hope. And she was so... We had Zoomed, actually, so we were face to face, and I think, again, that was something that helped, because she could see me listening and really taking in everything that she had to say. And for some people, like me, I'm similar, actually reliving those sorts of experiences in our lives, I find it quite cathartic. It's almost like each time you relive it, your thinking shifts from pain and despair to acceptance and understanding with each time that I explain it. But those were a long time ago, those two deaths in her life. Not to take anything away from the pain, but we had been discussing that as sort of years later. So I do wonder if it would have been a different story had it just happened.
It's where she even says, doesn't she, that she spoke to someone who just lost a parent in February 21, and she acknowledged, gosh, that's so recent. And we have to remember that Sarah is talking about it, because, as Natalie says, it's easier said than done. Sarah is talking about it after several years, and for some, obviously, there's such a rawness, but there is, I think, what that highlights is there's a huge amount of light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to not getting over it, but getting through it, as she says so eloquently I mean, she's so pragmatic anyway, but I do like the idea of a shrine, because actually we don't talk about grief enough in this country. Even if you go to Ireland, there'll be a wake around the coffin, and people are a lot more sort of free at expressing grief. And I actually think we should embrace some other cultures' sort of observations of grief, because shrines are really beautiful things. I love shrines. It's so silly, but I went to Harrods after Diana died, and Muhammad Al-Fayed had done that really beautiful shrine
behind glass. Yeah,
I don't see it as anything vulgar or weird, and I think it's wonderful to walk into someone's home, and I'm not talking sort of Alan Partridge the fan, a whole room or anything like that, but I think it's really lovely to walk into someone's home and clearly see that someone's being remembered, and to open a conversation about that person, and to talk about the life of that person, because for some, talking about death can never be so painful for the rest of your life. There's certain deaths I just can't talk about, and even thinking about talking about them now, I get very, very het up. And so, but talking about the life of that person, I think that's what shrines do so beautifully.
I agree.
I've got
actually,
a question for all of you, or just a discussion point is, there's someone close to me in my life that's recently lost someone in a very tragic way, and I do think it varies on how you deal with something, how you deal with grief, how you lost this person, but I find it really difficult knowing what to say or knowing how to deal with it, because it's not something that I'm going through, but I feel their pain through them. And it's knowing how to deal with that and knowing what to say. And I know deep down that it's really important to talk about it. And I think this is a great thing to be talking about on the podcast. And thank you, Stephen, for opening it up. And thank you to Sarah for being so open as well. But being that friend, being the family member who has to navigate how to deal with it. Do any of you have any sort of ideas on how to go about, talking about it, or not, if it feels like they don't want to?
Well, I think Sarah said something when she in her conversation with Stephen when she lost her brother Andrew, AJ, and she almost didn't want to put that burden of loss on her friends. She didn't want to let them know how painful it was. And she might have put a brave face on it, and, people in the periphery might have thought, she's getting over it, for want of a better word.
Yeah.
But I think just letting that person know that actually, whether they look like they're getting over it or not, just letting them know that you're there if they want to talk about it, or even if they don't want to talk about it, just letting them know that you're there as comfort, just to hold their hand and just sit next to them or whatever. I just think being there and letting them know that you're there for them for that reason is all they need. And then if they want to talk about it, if they're ready to talk about it, then they will. But I just think letting them know that you are there for them when they're ready.
I struggled last year when my best friend lost her mum, not suddenly, but tragically. And it's still raw. And it's the first death of a parent, I suppose, I dealt with. And, I've dealt with a parent losing a child, losing siblings, losing friends, losing elderly relatives. But this was the first time I'd experienced that sort of rawness of, that connection, and it stung. And so I felt useless at the beginning. I really did, because she rang me when I was in Ireland. No, I knew it was coming. We knew it was coming. She rang me and broke down and said she died. And I was stunned. I went, okay, all right. And we had nothing to say. We had nothing to say to one another. And it wasn't I didn't want to, or she didn't want to say anything. We just both respected that there was nothing to say other than the worst has happened. Now we need to move on. And it's taken a year for us to talk about her as a dead person now, and as a starting to become a memory as opposed to a pain. And but like Hayley said, everybody's different. You're an intuitive person, Natalie. I think you'll know when that person needs you in what capacity. Sometimes I'll text my friend a picture of a robin that I've seen, because we have this, the robin is a past relative visiting you. So I'll just tell her, or sometimes I'll be, in fact, sometimes I'm honest with her and say, I dreamt about Jill last night and I woke up crying, because I want her to know that, although she has family and friends around her, of course she does, that grief is rippling through everybody, and that she's not alone. And
That's so nice to
I
share
don't do it
that.
to remind her that her mum died, because she knows that every day.
Yeah.
But I do remind her every time, every week at least, that I still think of her, and it hurts me, not as much as her, obviously, but that she's not suffering in silence in this very raw state. And then in years to come, we'll laugh. And we do laugh now. We laugh at some of the ridiculous things that she used to say. But for her, I want the memory there for her. I want her to have my interpretation of her mother.
Forging her own, really,
yes,
as well.
Yeah, because don't forget, you have a memory of a person, but other people have a different memory of that same person. And I want every facet of that person to be kept alive in the memory, I suppose. And I think that's the best thing you can do is just be available.
But it's so hard.
And also, it goes back to what we said at the beginning. It's normalising these conversations, so it's a safe environment for people to talk about it. They don't feel like they're bringing anyone down, or I don't know. It's okay. It's okay to talk about death. It's okay to talk about.
I don't feel sad if somebody tells me a
those
sad story of death. I feel honoured.
Yeah, exactly.
And humbled that you can cry with me, or that you feel safe that I won't laugh at you or tell you to get over it. I would never do that. You and it is a raw subject, and I think that's why we've tabooed it. The I suppose the idea of a death was, it was kept hushed and quiet, and
I think a lot of the reason is that it's taboo is that, from my experience, I haven't really experienced grief so much. I mean, two of my grandparents have died, but they were old and they were anyway. I think the thing that I find difficult is knowing if they want to talk about it, and that's that's the taboo part of it. I don't want to bring it up if they don't want to talk about it. But like you said, Hayley, and like we're discussing, I think it is very important for us to just be there. I
think there's a point where we need to be brave and reach that hand out and say, do you want to talk about it? But also accept that if there's not an angry retaliation, but potentially an angry retaliation, that it's not at you, it's at the situation. Yeah. And I've had to deal with, the crying parent who lost a child screaming at me one day and then crying on my shoulder the next, asking me if it's all right. And that's why I think it's difficult for some people. And I still struggle now, and I think, am I being helpful or a hindrance? Or do I say something? Or
The thing is, with grief, it's massive, isn't it? It's huge, because everybody's experience is different, because it's so personal, and everybody's it's the person that you've lost, that experience of grief is different. So whether you've lost a grandparent or a friend or a sibling or a child, it's different. Every experience of grief is different, because a lot of it relates to your relationship with that person. So, your relationship with a grandparent is long and vast, and they might have lived a very, very long, happy life, and they died at however old. And, it's their death is sad, but then it becomes a celebration of their life. But then when you lose a child and they're very young and they haven't lived their life, then that's a very different sort of grief. And
God, it's so difficult.
You can't celebrate that life because they haven't lived that life. And experiencing that grief is very hard to get beyond.
Yeah, it's that. I think I was listening to a story the other day, and somebody summed up grief, and it was the suffocation in the finality of death. And I think it couldn't be more true, because it's that finality, as if to say, that's it, done.
Yeah.
You had your lot.
There is no
And-
more. You're never going to experience anything else with this person.
And circumstances as well, depending what the circumstances are. Sarah talks about she was so grateful her father wasn't ill, but she would have loved the chance to have said goodbye. So there's circumstances as well as that final end. And the same with pets. I don't want to ever belittle anyone who's
not
lost
at
a
all.
pet. Because one of my grief stories, whilst I am fully aware of its scope to me compared to everyone else, is too unbearable to talk about. But it surrounds a dog. But I do find I'm terrible when there's been a death announcement, or sometimes when people post on Facebook, I almost think, oh God, I just don't want to comment, or I don't want to like that, or I don't know what to say. And we had a family member die very recently, and I almost thought about, you said it, Stephen, before, it's sharing a death of someone or grief with people is quite, I would never announce it publicly, but so I chose to share it to a few people, because also I didn't want to put that on them that day. I didn't know what they were going through that day, and to offload that as well. So you're going through all these awful sort of questions anyway, and not knowing what to do. And I think just being there, Natalie, I know you're so conflicted as to how to react in something still so raw. And I think exactly that, just be your lovely, wonderful you, because that's all you can be. And really weirdly, I'm trying to think how to say this without saying too much, but I have a very good friend who was very good friends with Caroline Flack. And all I thought about was how they would be coping, especially with the media circus that was around it. So then that brought me on to, well, I don't want to seem like an ambulance chaser, or am I only messaging because, I'm in, and I really thought, what's more important, me worrying about what they're going to think, or actually me being there and them actually really needing that. And the worst thing that's going to happen is they don't reply or say, I can't really talk to you. And I didn't ask about any of the circumstances. I just said, how are you? And they replied and actually said, you're actually the only person that's really asked that. And I will never forget that. And because so many people wanted to ask about the circumstances. And sorry, my mic's literally just fallen into my lap. I'm so sorry. I hope that didn't make a noise. But it's so hard to know what to say, because my role was only there as a friend to that person, because I knew the grief they would be suffering, but also the fact that they couldn't really talk to anyone. So just being there for someone is
But that's all you want, isn't it? All you want is to say, I hope you're okay.
Yeah, exactly.
I am here
that is
if
all
you
I
need
said.
me.
That
you
is all
don't
I
need
said.
a reply.
No.
You don't want a reply. You just want them to know that you're there for them.
Yeah,
I think also
that.
What's important to remember, and Natalie, especially you at this time, is what's sweet about you is that you're concerned about that person that you're approaching and talking to, but clearly you're grieving, and that's something that you mustn't forget. I felt guilty for crying around my friend because I hadn't lost my mother, but in time she explained that actually I need to see that, because I need to know I'm not on my own doing this.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. Well, that's how I feel. It's my brother's wife lost her brother, who was 19, just for a bit of context, but in a very tragic car accident. But that's what I feel. I feel guilty for sobbing my eyes out.
No,
You shouldn't.
Because it's not me that's lost someone. I didn't even meet him. But the pain I feel for her, it's just...
You're sad for her.
It just breaks my heart.
But
that
that
shows
grief,
empathy.
that's empathy, and that's grief, and that's something that, and I know that feeling, that guilty feeling of why am I crying, but
Yeah.
it just shows that you love a person enough to absorb some of their grief. I couldn't imagine, I remember my brother lost his best friend as a teenager when they were 17, and like crying for my brother. For my brother, and I was sad for Sarah listening to her stories, and it was the first time we've met. So I think it shows you're human.
It's human connection, isn't it? It's human attachment, and we empathise with each other, and we feel grief and we feel emotion when somebody that we love feels grief, and
but also it's not just love. I think I think I feel refreshed by my ability to absorb somebody else's pain and recognise it, because I don't do it to make myself cry. But I was just before we started recording, I'm watching a series. It's a very sad thing on Netflix about unsolved murder cases, but they were interviewing a couple a married couple who had lost a child to murder. And they never found the answer. And it was a very intense interview. And I found myself just overwhelmed with grief for this couple. It was 33 years after they lost their daughter. And I felt, throughout the entire thing, I felt silly. But then I thought, but no, I'm not being silly. I'm able to connect with these people and recognise
you're being human.
Pain is, and I think it's fair to say that. And if I met them, cried with them, I wouldn't feel silly. Don't forget, millions of people lined the streets around the world and cried for Lady Diana 25 years ago.
Yeah, one of them.
And so exactly, and so for you to feel grief for someone that you love is not something. I don't think it's something to be ashamed of. I think it's something to be recognised and celebrated.
It's interesting that you say that you said I am sharing her grief, and what made me think of what that made me think of was that if I don't show her, if I try and hide away the fact that I am grieving with her and with my brother, then they'll never know. So am I doing her any favours, or should I be, being open in the fact that I'm grieving with her? Does that make sense?
It does.
Never underplay empathy, Natalie.
Yeah.
Just you being you. Empathy is so undervalued, and we've spoken about empathy before, and often a lot of what sounds like top trumping, to almost toxic positivity, often is just empathy, and people just wanting to let you know that they've been through that too, and they're thinking of you. And just you can tell that you're absolutely ravaged by grief, but your first thought is the person that you think is suffering the most. And I think that empathy enough is so soul warming to have someone like you in their life who understands and is being so cautious around this awful situation that is still so raw.
Yeah,
it's so special.
I think what we haven't touched upon is the word grief. I mentioned this at the beginning. It's an umbrella term, and it doesn't just relate to death. It relates to loss, and I think it's Meredith. You were very cautious in the way that you spoke about losing a pet. No, it's exactly the same.
I feel so silly because I can't even talk about it.
My mum still has the ashes of her two dogs in her drawer. She buried her mother within a week, but her ashes of her precious babies are in the drawer because she can't bear to part with them. That's her loss, and she's entitled to that.
I have blankets under my bed.
Yes, exactly.
I'm going to go.
Yep. and it's not silly. You're not silly for grieving, and I think we need to accept that loss is everywhere, whether we call it the death of a loved one or the loss of something that we know is never going to come back. And I remember this is going to sound even sillier. I remember my brother losing two of his fingers in a commercial accident at work, and having to explain to him that he was grieving a loss, because it's a shocking final change, or a change that will never be rectified. And that acceptance that
and
is
relationships
a loss.
As well.
Yes, exactly. And
Breakups,
Hayley said it before. Grief is so personal, and it can be a grandparent, or the worst tragedy, I think, as a mother is a child. But there is exactly that. There's losing a limb. There's your home being destroyed and every memory being gone. No one can say that their grief is more important than anyone else's. It's like I said, it's not a game of top trumps, and that's that fine line between empathy, isn't it? Of just, if someone's grieving, just let them grieve.
Yeah.
Just let them fucking cry and be raw and just be there. And you said that when you rang your friend, when your friend rang you to let you know that her mother had died, and I even struggled saying died then because I know how real it is for you, and I didn't know what to say then. But the fact you said nothing to each other, it's such a cliche, but that silence would have spoken in abundance, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I didn't want to. I didn't feel like there was a word in my mind that would make it any better, and so I vowed to her then I'll help her remember her mum for the rest of her life or our lives, and I'm doing it. And that's that, and it's not hard, but I felt silly because we are raised on Hollywood films. There's an expectation of what grief we have an expectation of what grief looks like, brought to us by television, whether it's EastEnders or a film or other people and other cultures. But it's actually a really personal thing, not just to cultures, but to individuals. I for one, I can't go to funerals. They horrify me. The whole thing is
so sad,
terrifying. They frighten me. I've never felt. I've had full-blown anxiety attacks in the middle of a funeral, and so I just don't go now because I don't want to make it about me, whereas some people go to funerals of people they barely know because it's their way of grieving a loss, and I think it's
there is that fear of making a death. Natalie, I know exactly where you're coming from, and spoiler alert: if anyone hasn't seen Sex of the City, because I will say when we've stopped talking about it, but there's a death, and there's a scene, and one of the characters completely overreacts in the funeral home, and the funeral parlour owner believes that they're the wife, and it lightens the situation, but there's that. Then she's, the torment of, it made it all about me. But actually, sometimes that can really lighten a situation. But also, it still shows that person again, empathy. It's so underplayed. And actually, if someone is really, really grieving, it's like, wow, you really love them too, or you're having a panic attack and. I wouldn't look at that and think, oh, they're stealing the show, throwing themselves on, the coffin or something like that. But I would think, God, they're obviously really grieving. And we've just got to be a lot more compassionate and understanding about how people deal with grief. And it can make people feel so uncomfortable when someone starts crying. But Natalie, I think it's really beautiful that you're crying. It shows that you're a human.
I cry a lot.
I think all four of us have cried at some point during this interview, and I don't think it would be. I think it would do us an injustice to say I didn't cry, but I still cry at a loss. My grandmother died 21 years ago. It still hurts. When I play that Fleetwood Mac song, I'll cry.
Songs are terrible. I mean, songs are wonderful.
And you talk about smell as well in the interview. How smell can bring something back. And...
Oh gosh, 100%. Sarah mentioned that in the absolute depths of her grief, when she lost her dad and also her brother AJ, that there were moments of just uncontrollable laughter.
Yeah, gallows humour.
But
I've never heard that expression before.
Have you not? Gallows humour, yeah.
No.
Well, gallows humour is that sort of quite dark, sort of black comedy sort of humour. But also, and I agreed with her. She was saying there was a moment where she just started laughing, and it is almost like your body is protecting you because you have just reached the lowest depths that you can possibly go, and there is no deeper for you to go. And then it's almost like I'm just going to laugh about the most irreverent, ridiculous thing because I just need to lift myself up from this pit. And I don't care what it's about, and it might be irreverent or whatever, but it is almost like your body is protecting you. It's it's just, I just need that release. I just need that light. I just need that lift for a moment. And then I can settle back down into the pit of despair and grief.
Yeah.
Do you think funerals help? Do you think they do provide some relief? Do you think waiting for the funeral is I've never experienced, thank God, but obviously we all will at some stage, but I've never experienced as an adult, having
I've experienced many funerals.
Organising of one,
unfortunately.
And sort of that,
And yes, I think when you're grieving a significant loss and a funeral is on the horizon, I guess it almost gives you something to focus on. But then there is that point when the funeral comes and goes, or it's what happens beyond it. Then there's nothing. It's just
there's long nights when you're left with your own thoughts.
I think I feel everything shifts after the funeral for me in terms of the process, and I despise. And the worst thing is when a couple of years ago when I lost somebody close to me, and I felt sort of ashamed because in my head, within moments of that person passing, I thought, oh God, we've got to have a funeral. Oh, I feel sick, which is awful. But then that I knew. But for me, I don't benefit from funerals. But some people need that sort of pageantry almost. Yeah, but it's
Do you know what
closure.
it is that makes you so anxious about the funerals? Have you sort of
I think there's various
identified it?
things. I think it's dealing with so many people's grief,
Right, okay.
all in one place.
Yeah.
And it's not that I don't want to. It's just I fear gallows humour. I don't know what to say. There's the coffin. There's the hearse. There's the everything. And I loved Jill's funeral because I was very honoured to have been asked because it was the middle of lockdown last year. It was August last year, and so I was one of 30 people, including the pallbearers, and so I was honoured to have been asked to go. It was, of course, it was I was just beside myself with just grief and fear. And I remember baking a cake. I had made her a carrot cake for her last birthday, and so I said I'd make her the carrot cake for the wake because I knew then that gave me a focus. I had a job to do. That was my job. I couldn't fail her. I had to make her cake for the funeral. And when I got there, it wasn't nearly as bad as I thought. And it was a wonderful, they called it a humanitarian group funeral. It was in the woods over near, not far from where I live in Sear Green. And it's a beautiful woodland, and there's no gravestones. It's all sort of little statues of robins and fish and whatever you want, and benches, and it was, I could deal with it. But the most wonderful part was in the midst of, her husband. I'm going to go. Her husband giving his final speech goodbye, and everybody just suffocating with tears. All of a sudden, there was this almighty clap of thunder. And he just looked up and he went, she's pissed off. She's pissed off because she's not at her own funeral. And of course, everything just lifted. This weight was lifted because all of a sudden we were back to what she was like. And it was just wonderful because even though, they're playing music as they're lowering her coffin, all I kept thinking was, she's got FOMO because she wasn't invited to her own funeral. And so I find, but that doesn't always happen for some people. But for me, I needed that break, that sort of relief.
It's wonderful when a funeral can be a celebration of somebody's life and to be turned into something a bit lighter, because that person would not. I'm sure would not want everybody to be bereft at their graveside and.
She would have been horrified. Jill would have been horrified.
No, I want everyone weeping and sobbing. Everyone in black. I want it all to be House of Gucci, like that.
I actually had so my brother and his wife got married this year, a few months after her brother's death, and the moment it was a very emotional day for very many reasons, but the moment my gorgeous sister-in-law's father mentioned his son in his speech, the moment we all broke down, we realised we were all in it together. We were
Yes.
there celebrating not only my brother and his wife, but we were celebrating her brother as well. And it just turned the whole... It was such an amazing, amazing day, an amazing week. Everyone was just, you know, life is too short. We all had that sort of feeling of we have to make the most of this day,
Absolutely.
of this life, because you just don't know when it's going to end. And we did that for him because he wasn't lucky enough to be there with us. So it not only can it bring everyone together at funerals, but also at other special events where everyone comes together as well, like a wedding.
Yeah.
And it was just beautiful.
Yeah.
Jeremy
sounds
did a
amazing.
toast for my cousin's husband, who we lost far too young in an accident. And as he gave the toast at our wedding, the sun came out, and it was really beautiful. It was just, he mentioned him that he was absent, and it was just, there are moments like that which everyone then has that moment of a mini epiphany, don't they? And hopefully it's not that, as you said. So Stephen, honestly, when you said you get engulfed, you get suffocated in tears, that really does describe the feeling of complete grief when you're at a funeral. And
Yeah.
it's so heartbreaking. And you know, everyone is just, because we're so bloody British and none of us are wanting to cry. And it's suffocating, isn't it? And I think that's why we should all just embrace crying a lot more, and maybe be a bit more like, you know, the Catholics. Catholics love a good cry.
Yeah, I mean, I think crying is an entirely different subject, but they are so closely linked. So Sarah and I, obviously being familiar with one another, but not friends like Hayley and Sarah. So there wasn't that familiarity, but after a good 15, 20 minutes, I knew that I was safe with her, and there were when I teared up and she teared up, and it's a trust thing. It's a personal thing. It's we spoke on the podcast in season 1 about some subjects which were really difficult, which meant that we couldn't continue speaking. But it's that sort of, I hate the feeling of shame that is associated with it, because I don't want to make people feel uncomfortable, but at the same time I also conversely want people to see a man crying, or just a human crying over something that is so very close and painful and personal to them. I don't believe I've ever met anybody who hasn't cried. Some people cry more than others. I cried more than I realised. But it's not a sign of weakness at all. It's a sign of, for me, it's just a show of emotion, and it's wonderful. It's, and at the time I can feel a bit like, oh God, I hope they're okay, or what can I say or do? But afterwards I think, I'm glad they did that. I'm glad they got that out, because clearly it was needed. And if even if in silence I was able to help, it's a good and positive feeling.
Well, it goes back to what we said at the beginning, isn't it? That normalising these conversations around death and grief and loss, and whatever that means to anyone, is really important, and creating a safe environment where somebody feels that they can sit down and talk to you about how they're feeling, and whether that means that they cry or not. I just think it's so beneficial for everyone.
Yeah.
And for their mental health, and we're not bottling it up, and we talked about it in season 1 with Joanna, talking about mental health and talking about suicide, and she's a suicide prevention. She does that with part of her work, as you do with grassroots, Stephen, and normalising the conversation around it, normalising. Talking about your mental health, whatever you're feeling, just means that people are more likely to talk about it. And so I think normalising this conversation around death and grief and loss, which I really feel that you and Sarah did, you just made it. It wasn't, let's get our tissues out and we're going to weep into them. It was a celebration of the life of the people that you were talking about.
Yeah.
But it was also normalising those feelings that you felt, normalising that gallows humour. Everybody feels that. Everybody
I think
feels that,
Sarah
but they
was-
don't want to talk about it.
No,
And
Sarah
it's
was
just
so eloquent and she just spoke so beautifully and in such great detail that was
it
so
was really
relatable.
insightful. I think it was really
And
insightful.
yeah, the way she described things, and for me, I'll never forget the way she described the feeling of wind on her face was 100 times more intense. And I remember Jill's funeral feeling the heat of the sun as if I was in a furnace. And then the moment there was a breeze, I felt like I was in the fridge. Everything is so intense. And I thought it was just me, but it's not. And it's you know, there's no shame in going over this. And what I also found with talking about Sarah's grief was it played back memories of grief in my mind. And I think you think to yourself, oh, I feel bad for bringing up my grief. But actually what her story did was it reminded me to cry. It reminded me to let out my emotion through her story. And maybe it also does it for her. Maybe she'll talk to her friend about grief, and that reminds her that she lost her dad, and it's okay to cry about it sometimes. And I think it's a perpetual cycle, but if you try to stop it and force it back down, that's when we fear grief, and that's when it becomes that really big problem.
Well, that's when it becomes a problem, isn't it? And also remembering that everybody's experience of grief is different. You know, we could have both lost the same person, but our experience of that grief would be different because our relationship with that person is different.
Yeah.
So unique. Yeah.
It's so complex and it's so unique, and it matters. It matters because of the relationship that you have with that person. It matters because of who you are and how you deal with grief. It's just so multi-layered and so complex.
And it is so scary. It's my biggest fear, grief. No one wants to feel grief. It's such a horrible, horrible, brutal thing. And
also grief,
we all feel grief.
Grief lingers with you. You know, I've experienced awful grief that is over 10 years old, and I still can't talk about it just because it's still so raw in my heart. But for other people it might not be, and it's everyone is
you're
so
entitled
different.
you're entitled to feel what you want to feel, and this is why I think what would be a big mistake is if somebody's grieving is to give them some awful leaflet from the GP surgery about how to deal with grief, because there's no rule book. You must
also to assume that they're over it.
Yes, to assume that somebody's over it, or to assume that their pain diminishes over time. It doesn't, and you don't have it. Really, it's personal, and that I think that's it. We've touched on that a couple of times with this conversation. It's personal, and we must respect that for ourselves, and we must respect it for other people. And if somebody wants to build a shrine in their cupboard, or if somebody wants to never mention it again, that's how they're dealing with it.
Absolutely.
And equally to assume that they're not okay. They might just not be able to share how they are.
We're always told in sales, you know, never use an open-ended question, but the power of "Are you okay?" which is
twice.
Is
And
I think sometimes that's underplayed as well.
And also somebody might not be able to talk about it because they might not have the words. They might not be able to actually vocalise how they're feeling, especially generations older than us. You know, they might be an 80-year-old woman that lost a child, and she actually can't talk about because she can't actually formulate those words. Because
she was told never to, you know, she was told that it was taboo and it was kept under wraps.
Absolutely.
Because, you know, it's just one of those things. It's a bit like you said, Hayley, it's a bit like mental health. Nobody wants it, but we have to accept it because it's there.
It's part of life.
Yeah, and the more we bring it, bring it to the surface,
and normalising it takes away the monster, doesn't it? And I think at least if we can manage that, it's pain management, isn't it? And knowing that you can roar your heart out down the phone to your friends, but also at the same time ring them up and just say nothing, and your friend might not be able to say anything because they're a bit crap, but just knowing that you're
as
both
long as you create
there.
a safe space and just normalise talking about it. And
normalising doesn't necessarily mean taking away the importance of it.
No.
which I
No,
think is...
Sarah said that, didn't she? When someone
She was
said, "Oh,
concerned.
you'll only experience it once," and is that toxic positivity when someone kind of tells you can't be sad because there's something worse, or it's
think
that
so,
it's that
yeah.
sort of? She said, people would come up to her and think she was okay and say something a bit, and you mustn't.
No, because it's to the individual. I say that to myself sometimes, not when I'm grieving, but I just sort of think, oh God, I haven't got this and I haven't got that. Oh, life is tragic. But then I do sit there and remind myself of A, what I have, and B, that other people don't have it and cannot achieve that. That's I think there's a time and a place for that sort of speech. But I know that as and when the time comes for my mum to die, I know that my experience will be different to that of my friends, and she'll deal with me how I ask her to deal with me. And so, it is personal. I won't deal with it the way that she did because A, we won't be in a pandemic. My mum will be a different age. She's a different person. Everything's different. Everything is different. Her sister is dealing with her mother's death differently to the way that she's dealing with it. And, the more you try to fit everything into one category or try to,
you can't
categorize grief as one particular thing, the more people struggle with it. It's the same with everything in this life at the moment. We're slowly learning that there are 7 billion individual people on this planet who have 7 billion different ways of dealing with their own life. And I think that's wonderful and it's fascinating. And the more we do allow that difference, I think the more advanced we will become, and the easier. I think grief will start to become a lot easier for the next generations down the line.
I hope so, because I think it's okay for us now as we've got a bit older. But even when I was a child, as I'm sure you've all experienced it, it was just a stiff upper lip. Let's just get on with it. Let's just brush those overwhelming emotions under the carpet. We're strong, rise above it, all of that. But no, don't just let it out.
I think what's important to remember as well is we are in a pandemic and so many people have actually lost someone, and there's so many children suddenly surrounded by grief and a very, very confusing time. And whilst we're all, up in arms about what's going on in government, imagine if you are grieving a loved one during this. I mean, we're angry as it is. So the fact that there's people now, so many people, so this is why now we have to normalise talking about it, because there are so many experiencing grief at the moment, having just still being in a pandemic. We've lost so many people in this country, and I don't know anyone that hasn't actually really been affected by it, even if it's been a death by other means, but they then haven't been able to attend a funeral or really significant things that are so important. And so, we need to accelerate normalising it, actually, Hayley, don't you think? Because
yeah, I agree.
There's so much grief now at the moment, isn't there? I mean, the world's bloody scary and frightening. And
yeah, I lost my aunt at the beginning of the pandemic, my dad's sister, and it was a very small funeral. Only a few people were allowed to go, and that continues. Continues
sad.
for families around the country, and it's really sad. It's really, really sad.
I think that's a lovely way to realise that there are so many joys in life. There's so many good things about life. I think I'm a very positive person, but just saying that it's so sad, and of course it is, I don't want to take away that. But we do have to think about all of the amazing things that happen and the joy we can find in our lives as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, 100%.
Grief is a bit like the pandemic. It beat us to the ground, but it also made us realise
awakening
what's left and what we have got. And
Yeah.
grief has done that for me. I'm closer to my mum now, maybe just marginally, but closer because I think I want to absorb her and have that. What my friend had with her mum, and so when the time comes, I can say I didn't take anything for granted, but we do have opportunities around us, like you said, Natalie. We've got another day. We've got our lives. Your sister-in-law's father's speech made everybody realise that there's a lot to be thankful for.
Yeah.
And I, I don't feel like, when I'm grieving, I think I don't want to think like that. But when I pass through, I think you're right. I've got so much to be thankful for. So I respect the grief, but I also, what's the expression? Sunshine after the rain. I suppose there is. It's a bit corny, but it is part of grief. Is that you're suddenly reminded of what is good.
Has that helped a bit, Natalie?
Yeah. This conversation has just been. It's been so beneficial. And hopefully not just for me, but hopefully for all of our listeners as well. Thank you, Stephen, for
thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Sarah, I really appreciate it.
I do want to say, I think I'm going to say end this podcast episode by again saying thank you so much to Sarah for sharing her stories. It's brave, it's hard to do, but she had an experience to share, and I'm grateful to her for doing it. And thank you, Birds, as well, because we've all shared a bit tonight. We've all had some tears, but we've done something that not a lot of people can do, and that's express grief openly and allow it to be seen and seen as something that isn't shameful and something that is very normal.
This episode is dedicated to
Benjamin, Barbara and Frank,
Jill and George,
Charlotte and Rosa,
Francis, Chris, AJ and Garth. So that wraps the end of this episode of For Calling Birds. If you've been affected by anything that we've spoken about in this episode, please see the show notes for references and support.